So thank you, Howard. Today I'm going to start this session by providing a few minutes of background on the NIOSH and PPTL role in respiratory protection, conformity assessment, and occupational settings. And I will be followed by Jeff Peterson, who will provide more details regarding the NIOSH Respirator Approval Program. Next slide. So our presentation is going to cover one of the 4 topics planned for session 4. One highlighted in red. Thanks. Next, okay, stay on that slide, please. And so NIOSH and PPTL focuses its efforts on PPE research, surveillance, conformity assessment, and outreach and interventions. And the formal mission of our work is to advance the state of knowledge and applications of personal protective technologies. Next slide. The cornerstone of the NIOSH and PPTL work is the Respirator Approval Program. NIOSH and PPTL approves all respirators that you see on the left-hand side of this slide, all respirators that are used in workplaces across the country, while OSHA oversees respiratory protection program worker compliance under its respiratory protection standard 1910-134. OSHA requires each workplace using respirators to establish a formal respiratory protection program. NIOSH also approves respirators used in healthcare settings, and we work very closely with the FDA in this regard, who has requirements for fluid resistance, flammability, and biocompatibility for those respirators that are used in healthcare settings. Under a memorandum of agreement between NIOSH and FDA, published in 2018, NIOSH is now executing these requirements that the FDA has through our approval process. However, manufacturers still must list their products and register them with the FDA. Next slide, please. So NPPTL is responsible for addressing personal protective equipment workplace needs associated with 3 strategic goals you see here at the bottom of the slide: reducing exposure to inhalation hazards, dermal hazards, and injury hazards. The inner ring on this slide is solid in this figure to represent the NIOSH role in all aspects of respiratory protection and reducing exposure to inhalation hazards. In this regard, we lead the research and surveillance activities that feed into the standards development efforts, both from a federal and from a consensus standards standpoint, where we serve as on a leadership role on the consensus standards. And from a 42 CFR Part 84 perspective, that is the federal standard associated with the respirator protection standard. We also lead respiratory protection conformity assessment for the nation, including respirator pre-approval and post-approval activities. In the goals associated with the dermal and injury hazards, we have a leadership role in the research similar to the other to the respiratory goal in reducing exposure to inhalation hazards. But there is not a federal standard, and we do not certify those products. We are involved in research, involved in consensus standard development, and we do conduct some post-market evaluation in those areas as well. Next slide. As was mentioned yesterday, conformity assessment is the demonstration that specified requirements relating to a product, process, person, or body are fulfilled. And conformity assessment, as we've heard throughout these past 2 days, is important to address worker safety and health. NIOSH is responsible for conformity assessment for respirators used in occupational settings as enforced by OSHA. NIOSH also approves respirators for use in healthcare settings, including the evaluation of those requirements I mentioned on the previous slide, the biocompatibility, fluid resistance, and flammability. A robust conformity assessment program helps ensure that worker health and safety issues are addressed, and it also provides users or consumers with confidence that the product will perform as expected. For example, the KN95 respirators that we mentioned yesterday are expected to conform to a good standard, but the requirement is that the manufacturer has to declare that they conform to that standard. There is no requirement for a third-party test lab to evaluate those products to verify their conformance to the standard. And there is no one following up to make sure those products continue to meet the requirements of the standard. A robust conformity assessment program also gives companies a competitive edge because once users understand the meaning of a conformity assessment program, they're more likely to purchase a product that they know has been validated through a robust program. Next slide, please. So to this end, NIOSH and PPTL led the development of the PPE Conformity Assessment Framework that was mentioned yesterday. And this framework is important to apply when determining what hazards a workplace is experiencing. So if you look on the left-hand side, the first block, by understanding the hazards of the workplace or the general public, where the general public may have exposures, we then can determine if respirators and existing standards are available to address the particular hazards that are identified. And here is where we have the complexities associated with the contingent workers and the general public where the hazards are not clear-cut. We've heard we do not want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, but we have to keep in mind that the good has to be good enough to provide protection from the hazard. This is where it may be useful, again, to emphasize the value of NIOSH in this process. NIOSH has a deliberate and systematic approach to make sure that the product addresses the hazard and that there is science behind the standards. So NIOSH looks at the fact that the product is addressing the workplace hazard and that it will be safe for its intended use. If no existing standards are appropriate at these stages on the left-hand side, we then determine whether a standard should be developed to address the needs by establishing a federal standard under 42 CFR Part 84 I mentioned earlier. And if that is not the most appropriate approach, or if we can use a consensus standards process. And once a standard approach is determined, we work with partners to identify the conformity assessment method that should be used to execute the standard. And again, we always work to have science behind the standard and to understand what those hazards are. In the workplace, this is typically through 42 CFR Part 84. However, if we look at the fire services as an example, the fire services uses both the NIOSH approval through 42 CFR Part 84, and then on top of that, there are additional requirements that are identified through the National Fire Protection Association consensus standard process. So once the conformity assessment approach is determined, a post-market approach is established to ensure the products continue to conform to standards to which they were approved and certified. With the nature of work changing, there are many gaps that exist for these workers. In the absence of a comprehensive respiratory protection program, what does a respiratory protection program look like for these populations, and what are other approaches to respiratory protection and conformity assessment that are needed? These are the questions we hope to get answered. Similarly, some type of conformity assessment process should be implemented for the general public. We believe that the framework is applicable for all areas for the way it's used now in the standard workplace environment and for the populations we're talking about today. But the components of the process and the approaches to achieve them must be aligned with the general public's needs, and the key partners who should be involved and have authority in this area have to be established and be part of this process. Next slide. So as I mentioned, NIOSH, through its authorities under 42 CFR Part 84, approves respirators for use in workplaces across the country. And now I'd like to turn it over to Jeff Peterson to provide more detail regarding the process we use and the approach.